December 16, 1944 began like so many winter mornings in the Ardennes, dark, bitterly cold, and heavy with fog. Near the small village of Monschau, the ground was frozen hard as iron, and German infantry moved forward believing the forest would protect them, just as it always had. Then the sky itself turned hostile. American artillery screamed overhead, but instead of crashing into the earth or shattering trees, the shells detonated in the air. Perfectly timed. Perfectly placed. Steel fragments rained down from above, slicing through branches, flesh, and bone. Foxholes offered no safety. Trees became liabilities. Men who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front froze in disbelief as death came from a direction no doctrine had prepared them for. Veterans of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division instinctively threw themselves to the ground, waiting for the familiar impact pattern, the brief lull that usually followed. It never came. Every place they sought refuge became a killing zone. Ditches, tree trunks, shallow trenches, nothing mattered anymore. This was not artillery as they understood it. This was something else entirely, something terrifyingly precise. What they could not know in that moment was that a single American officer, Colonel Oscar Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group, had just changed the nature of the battle, and arguably the war itself. Axelson stood miles behind the front lines, staring at maps that told a grim story. The 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, lightly armed and never meant to hold ground, was being crushed by overwhelming German forces. Conventional artillery fire was failing to slow the advance. Orders from higher command were explicit. The most secret shell in the Allied arsenal was not to be used against ground troops. The risk of capture was considered too great. But Axelson understood something in that moment. Obedience meant annihilation. Disobedience meant a chance, however slim, to stop the German tide. Without authorization, without clearance, and knowing he might face a court-martial or worse, Axelson gave the order. Proximity-fused shells were loaded into American guns for ground combat for the first time. Inside those shells were tiny radar sets, no larger than coffee cans, capable of sensing the earth below them and detonating at the precise height needed to kill exposed infantry. The frozen forests of the Ardennes were about to become a laboratory for a revolution in warfare. This moment unfolded against the backdrop of Hitler's last great gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein had been launched with enormous ambition. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces were hurled into the Ardennes under cover of fog and secrecy. Hitler promised his generals that this offensive would split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. At 5:30 that morning, German artillery opened fire along an 85-mile front, achieving complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had missed the buildup entirely. Units holding the line were either inexperienced replacements or battle-worn veterans sent there to rest. For the Germans, the early hours felt like vindication. Advances were swift. American positions buckled. But near Monschau, something went wrong. The air itself betrayed them. Proximity-fused shells burst 30 to 50 feet overhead, spraying fragments in expanding cones of destruction. Soldiers were cut down even while lying flat. Men who had mastered survival under artillery fire found that every lesson they had learned was now obsolete. The science behind this devastation had taken years to perfect. The proximity fuse was one of the most complex engineering achievements of the war, rivaled only by the atomic bomb. Inside each fuse were more than 130 electronic components, including miniature vacuum tubes redesigned to survive accelerations of 20,000 times the force of gravity. At the moment of firing, a glass ampoule shattered to activate a battery, powering a radar transmitter that sent radio waves toward the ground. As the reflected signal intensified, The fuse calculated the optimal instant to detonate. This miracle of miniaturization was born at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, under the leadership of Dr. Merle Tuve. The lab operated with Manhattan Project level secrecy, disguised as a used car dealership in Maryland. At its peak, 3% of all American physicists worked on proximity fuse development. Every worker was compartmentalized. No one knew the full picture. Each fuse was tracked by serial number. Security was absolute. By late 1944, American industry had accomplished the unthinkable. Factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. Over 100 companies, RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Crosley, had retooled for production. What once cost hundreds of dollars per unit now cost less than 20. By the time Axelson made his unauthorized decision, the United States had built a weapon that could rewrite the mathematics of combat. The results at Monschau were immediate. The German attack stalled, then collapsed. Casualties mounted at a rate that shocked even hardened veterans. Reports raced up the chain of command. Within days, General Eisenhower himself requested authorization to release proximity fuses for general use. On December 21st, the restrictions were lifted. The secret weapon was unleashed across the entire Ardennes front. As the siege of Bastogne tightened, proximity fuses arrived just in time. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and outnumbered, relied heavily on artillery support. When German infantry advanced across snow-covered fields, airbursts ripped them apart before they could reach American lines. Entire platoons vanished in seconds. After General McAuliffe's famous "nuts" reply, German attacks intensified, and were annihilated overhead by shells that needed no adjustment, no observation, no mercy. African-American artillery units, including the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, played a critical role. Their 155 mm guns created lethal rings of airbursts that German forces could not penetrate. Prisoners later spoke of the terror, of shells that exploded above them with uncanny accuracy, of comrades fleeing before even seeing an American soldier. One of the most devastating demonstrations came along the Sauer River on Christmas Day. A German battalion attempted a nighttime crossing, believing darkness and fog concealed them. Proximity-fused shells shattered that illusion. General George S. Patton personally witnessed the aftermath. When the firing stopped, 702 bodies were counted. The battalion had ceased to exist. In the forests, the effect was even worse. Airbursts shattered branches into thousands of wooden missiles, transforming cover into shrapnel. A single shell could clear an area the size of a tennis court. German forest fighting doctrine collapsed overnight. There was no safe formation, no correct response. The air had become the battlefield. German intelligence failed catastrophically. Even when proximity-fused shells were captured, engineers dismissed them as impossible. Vacuum tubes in artillery shells defied their assumptions. Ironically, Germany had once led in proximity fuse research, but the program had been cancelled early in the war. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was far too late. By January 1945, proximity fuses were everywhere. Anti-aircraft guns used them to devastating effect during the Luftwaffe's last major offensive, Operation Bodenplatte. German aircraft fell from the sky in staggering numbers. The Luftwaffe never recovered. After the war, German commanders were blunt. They spoke of artillery that seemed to see, to think, to hunt. Statistics confirmed their fear. A fraction of American shells accounted for a disproportionate share of German casualties. The weapon shortened the battle. It shortened the war. Behind the numbers lay human cost on all sides. Teenagers conscripted into Germany's final defense died beneath invisible airbursts. American factory workers labored in secrecy, exhausted and unaware of the devastation their hands enabled. Yet without proximity fuses, the Battle of the Bulge might have dragged on longer, costing countless additional lives, on the front and in the camps awaiting liberation. When the German offensive finally collapsed in late January 1945, the Ardennes lay silent again. Snow covered the forests, hiding the scars. But warfare had changed forever. The proximity fuse proved that science, industry, and innovation could decide battles as surely as courage and numbers. From that frozen winter morning onward, war would never again be fought the same way. In the Ardennes, the air itself had become a weapon, and humanity had crossed into the technological age of warfare, where death could be calculated, optimized, and delivered by machines that sensed the world around them. The mathematics of war had been rewritten forever.